We left last week with Bill Clinton ultimately smoothing things over with China after a tense few years in the early 90s. However, in 2000, Clinton's 2 terms were up, and America went to the polls. And in totally non-controversial fashion, George W. Bush, son of Clinton's predecessor, George H.W. Bush, became the new president. And weirdly, Bush came out with a strong criticism that Bill Clinton had been too friendly with China. Now, if you tuned in last week, you'd remember that this was the exact criticism that Clinton had levelled against Bush's father.
Oh, how the tables have turned.
And Bush came in with something more of a hawkish approach. With China now 2 decades into its market revolution, it posed a real threat to American supremacy. Immediately, he increased arms sales to Taiwan, including 8 submarines. But then, just 8 months into his presidency, everything was about to change.
Hello there.
Okay, so yes, it's very cliche to include 9/11 in a prelude, but I'm going to argue something a little different to what you're used to. We're really used to focusing on how 9/11 changed the landscape of the Middle East, but I'm going to make an argument that 9/11 greatly impacted the Sino-US relationship and actually further helped China's rise to power. And so today's video is going to focus on 2 key issues. Firstly, how 9/11 changed the web of strategic alliances, but secondly, how China then knocked on the doors of superpower status during the years of the Bush administration. So when it came to 9/11, Jiang Zemin's China actually aligned themselves with that same Bush administration that had undercut them by selling to Taiwan. Now, 2 Chinese citizens were killed in the World Trade Center attacks, and China had been dealing with its own issues of domestic terrorism. The Uyghur issue was a tough one, and one that I'm not going to delve into too much detail here on this video, but basically this Chinese province here, Xinjiang, is where a whole bunch of Turkic Muslims live. Back in 1949, Xinjiang was annexed by the PRC after it supported Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese Civil War, and from the 1960s onwards, the Turkestan Islamic Party became a separatist force that was constantly a thorn in China's side as it pushed for independence. From 1990 to 2001, the Chinese government attributed 200 acts of terrorism to Turkic separatists, with 162 Chinese citizens killed and over 440 injured. And so, with China facing Islamic extremism at home, they voted in favour of UN Security Resolution 1373, where member states were encouraged to share their intelligence on terrorist groups in order to assist in combating international terrorism. And it wasn't just that. China supported a coalition campaign in Afghanistan and even contributed $150 million to the reconstruction of Afghanistan after the defeat of the Taliban.
I'm in! I'm in! I'm in! What's the job? I'm in!
This also had an important effect back in the USA. In US political circles, there's something called the Blue Team. Basically, this is an alliance of people in Congress and the media who are anti-China. They might receive donations from lobbyists who benefit from a tenser relationship with China, or might simply oppose China on ideological or economic grounds. Now, the Blue Team was mostly a Republican group, but there were a handful of Democrats there too. Now, as an organised web of advocates, the Blue Team was at its strongest at the beginning of the Bush administration. And if 9/11 didn't happen, I think there's a very real chance that the Blue Team would have been able to exert more control over Bush's China policy. However, after 9/11, Bush's foreign policy very much turned towards the war on terror, and China offered valuable support against North Korea. In 2003, North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and you can see more about that here. Now, obviously having a rogue country with nukes who Bush had earlier publicly included in his axis of evil,
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
concerned America. China had an on-again, off-again alliance with the Koreans, and China actually weighed in against Kim Jong-il, expressing its desire to see a denuclearized Korean peninsula. America also began to emphasize what was called the 4 Noes and 1 Without pledge. Basically, this pledge was that provided the PRC had no intention of using military force against Taiwan, Taiwan would not 1. Declare Taiwanese independence, 2. Change the national title from the Republic of China to the Republic of Taiwan, 3. Include the doctrine of special state-to-state relations in the Constitution of the Republic of China, or 4. Promote a referendum on unification or independence. Ultimately, by the time Hu Jintao was the new president of China, relations between the two were pretty smooth, and Bush even went to Beijing for the 2008 Olympics. I guess it was the geopolitical equivalent of The Rock and Vin Diesel finally becoming family. But while the strategic partnership between the two had improved since the beginning of Bush's presidency, the trade relationship would begin a strain it would never come back from. Now, Bill Clinton was a huge advocate of China joining the World Trade Organization because it would provide cheaper trade with a huge market. And George Bush supported Clinton's initiative, but instead framed the issue in terms of US exports, saying that more exporting to China's huge population would be great for American companies. Now, if you're a total dunce like me and when you see economic stuff you think,
the administration's plan for peace in the Middle East is shallow and pedantic.
I agree. Shallow and pedantic.
I agree as well. Shallow and pedantic.
well, basically, members of the World Trade Organization agree to minimize taxes on foreign imports from other members. And so having China as a member would be great for American companies because without import taxes, Chinese companies would be encouraged to buy American goods. Of course, the other effect is that in return, free trade encourages American companies to buy from China. And so the trade deficit that we saw with Bill Clinton last week was about to skyrocket. So why was America so keen for China to join the WTO? Was it simply that they got their maths wrong in regard to exports versus imports? Well, not quite. China's acceptance to the WTO was essential to their economic growth because if everyone put tariffs on them, then they couldn't become the world's manufacturer. Effectively, America was hoping that they could use this, China's standing on the WTO, as a way of leveraging them into doing what they wanted.
You set me up. I sure as hell did. So, it's up to you. You in? Or you out?
But as China joined the WTO, they really began to move ahead and prosper. From 1990 to 2015, the share of the Chinese population living in extreme poverty, and just for reference, extreme poverty is defined as living on less than $1.90 a day, declined from 67% to under 1%. And today, China's economy is 11 times larger than what it was in 2001, not to mention that trading goods between the United States and China increased from less than $100 billion in 1999 to $558 billion in 2019. But when I say trade between the two nations, I really mean Chinese exports to the USA. The trade deficit soared to $200 billion, and by this point, the influx of Chinese parts really started to visibly impact US companies. For example, in October 2005, Delphi Corp, the biggest US auto parts maker, filed for bankruptcy. Between 2001 and 2005, 230 furniture plants were closed in the United States, and this caused 55,000 jobs to be lost. On the other hand, China, which had a market share of 3% in the furniture industry, rose to 60% by 2005. Also, by controlling the distribution of cash, China also pegged its currency to 8.28 yuan per US dollar. Now, this undervalued currency kept exports at a cheap rate, and that could help China continue to be a manufacturing powerhouse. Now, obviously with cheap imports to America, jobs open up in other industries, but not manufacturing jobs. And so with a very disgruntled population, Senators Chuck Schumer, a Democrat, and Lindsey Graham, a Republican, proposed a 27.5% tariff on Chinese goods. But Bush never seriously entertained this as a valid option. Placing tariffs on Chinese goods would be a huge violation of the WTO rules and would create another enemy on top of all of Bush's war on terror enemies. So ultimately, Bush's policy towards China was pretty pragmatic. Though he initially antagonized them by supplying Taiwan with weapons, the war on terror provided the two superpowers with a strategic partnership, and China's entry to the WTO caused trade between the two to boom. However, previously Americans had opposed China only really on human rights grounds. But now the rise of China was creating a very real ripple as hundreds of thousands of Americans were losing their manufacturing jobs. And though this probably wasn't that important in Obama's election, it would certainly create the conditions for Donald Trump to be elected 8 years later. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, because next time we're looking at Barack Obama and how the global financial crisis made this relationship even more complicated. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.